And we are going to go out to Ohio. We're going to talk with Atheist Cethi. He, him has a question for you, Forrest. So I will let you have the mic, Cethi, and just ask Forrest your question.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. Forrest, I've been watching quite a few of your videos on sex and gender. Really interesting stuff. I've been learning a lot. There's one thing I heard you say that was just a little confusing. Maybe you could clarify, help me. On a different episode, I think it was of The Line, maybe, someone called in and they were talking about transgenderism, and they phrased it as not being the gender of your biological sex. And you objected to that phrasing by saying there is no gender of a sex because sex and gender are different. So there's no gender of a sex. I was just kind of confused because to me, that seemed like a fair way of describing it. I thought that was pretty consistent with a lot of other things. So I don't know, maybe you misspoke or maybe I'm just not understanding. So if you could clarify that.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly what call you're talking about. If I was being that detailed, though, it was probably because whoever I was talking to was really digging their heels on and using words like transgenderism, which is, bullshit. It's not a reasonable thing to call just the acceptance of the fact that some people are trans. And I don't think you're being rude by using that term. I just want to point out, don't use that term. But anyway, or I encourage you not to. But if I was being that detailed about it, it was probably because somebody was trying to really drive home their belief that sex and gender are the same thing. And that's simply not the case. You cannot boil gender down to a sex. You cannot predict gender from a sex. We do typically see a pattern where certain genders do align with certain sexes in a society, but it's really important to point out that that isn't diagnostic, and that doesn't mean that therefore this is the normal way to do things. Because gender is a social construct, it's constantly changing. It changes from culture to culture, from person to person, from generation to generation, from day to day. And there are plenty of cultures out there that have multiple or have more than two genders or have different concepts of genders. Even in our own culture, back in the 1700s, it was very masculine for a man to weep with emotion and to faint and to be overtaken by their feelings. The manly weep was a big thing. And nowadays we wouldn't allow that because our concept of gender has changed dramatically. And so we don't allow men to wear wigs and makeup and things like that anymore, and without calling them drag, you know what I mean? And so that's just kind of how it goes. And so what I was saying at that, I don't know the exact call you're talking about. I've talked about this shit a lot, but what I mean by a statement like that, or what I would mean at this moment today, is that gender and sex are different things. One is biological, one is social, neither one of which is a strict binary. In fact, the gender thing is so fluid and so changing. The fact alone that it's a social construct, not a biological one, it is necessarily not, it cannot be a strict binary. But in the same way that Christianity versus Islam isn't a binary, you know what I mean? It just doesn't make any friggin' sense. Watch some transphobic dickhead clip that and be like, see, they admit it's a religion. But the whole thing is that, because gender can't be boiled down to or predicted by sex, there is no gender of a sex. What we are talking about when we talk about trans people is that your gender and your sex are not congruent in the framework of the society that you are or the cultural network that you're currently living in. Because gender is built upon the culture, being outside of that cultural norm, that's where you get into trans and non-binary identities. Does that make a little bit more sense?
I think so. So if I'm understanding, when we talk about the congruence or the alignment, we're talking more just probability wise, the link between being a male and being a man. That's more just probability rather than there being an intrinsic link between the two.
I mean, I would raise an eyebrow at the word probability because I don't know what exactly you're talking about there, but I don't think you mean anything bad by it. See, I guess that's fine.
Generally, those two things are linked, but not always. I guess that's what I meant.
Yeah, and so that's. Okay. Yes, so that's the key, is that whenever we're talking about this stuff, we have to make sure that we're using the right terminology as best we can. And when you fuck up, you fix it and you move on. Just like you say, make a distinction. Are you talking about male and female, or are you talking about man and woman? you know? And if you're talking about male and female, are you talking about, is that all you're talking about? Because there's a bit more to it than that. We could be talking about male, female, and intersex persons who we would often lump in and put as categorize, just as male or female for convenience sake, but aren't going to fall into the same paradigm that others are. Are you talking about hormonal male? Are you talking about genetic male? Are you talking about chromosomal male? Are you talking about anatomical male? Are you talking about phenotypic male? And that's all different than man. That's a totally different word. That means a totally different thing. And so like in like biomed school, that's something that we do a lot. Like at the last semester, I was working in this anatomy lab for the whole semester, just tinkering on people all day long. And like that was a really important thing to say, is when you're talking about this person, this cadaver in front of you, what kind of man or male do you mean? What are you? Because if you say one thing, you could mean 30 other things. You need to be clear. So this is an anatomic male. And so I'm looking for these structures in the body. This is a phenotypic female, but in fact, their chromosomes actually read differently. And that's important. And so I'm making the distinction. I'm telling you what I'm talking about. That I'm going to say if this is a woman, because we knew this person when they were alive and knew what pronouns they prefer. You know what I mean? Like we actually had some cadavers in there that like we knew the people. And so I was comfortable saying, this man rather than this anatomical male cadaver, you know what I mean? Anatomic and phenotypic male that's fine to say. That's different than saying man. So that's what all that's about. It's just making sure to be really, really careful with the terminology that we're using from a scientific perspective in order to make sure that we're as accurate and as inclusive as possible. And I think you'll find that if you are being scientifically accurate, more often than not, you're also going to be inclusive, and vice versa as well. If you're being more deliberately inclusive, you are also almost always being more scientifically accurate as well. So that's why I make those things. I don't think anybody needs to be held to that same standard because, again, I'm doing that shit usually in an academic setting. But when I'm getting into an argument about it online, I try to be a little bit more careful, and that's where that's coming from. Sorry, I know I just talked a lot.
No, it was really, really good. I really love that thing you said at the end because I'm right there with you, too. I think the science is very much LGBTQ supportive. I think the actual data is so overwhelmingly pointing in that direction. Precisely. But I'll shut up because Sethi, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts, maybe some other questions. So what you got for us?
I think you pretty much answered. I got to do way more study on this to make sure I got it all straight. But I appreciate you explaining it. Yeah. So it sounds like maybe since being a man can kind of vary even like culture to culture, it doesn't
right
really
now
make sense to even say that male and man are intrinsically linked because that could mean different things to so many different people.
Precisely. Yeah. And like, that's what, when we say things like, trans men are men and trans women are women, like to then have somebody come back with some argument about chromosomes or about anatomy or whatever like that, because these are different concepts, that is missing the point. They are in the gender category that they're in. And so anatomy, chromosomes, whatever like that, isn't what we're talking about. If you want to say, anatomical or phenotypic female isn't this other, or things like that. Okay, well, then we can have that conversation. We can talk about the intricacies there. But at least let's have that conversation. You know what I mean? And so like that's what's really important is that like when we're coming from this from a biological and anthropological perspective, like these kind of buzzwords and catchphrases that you hear in the political space, no matter what side of this issue you find yourself on, they're really not as radical as they're painted as being. They're actually like just this is the facts on the ground, and we can all agree on the facts, and then we can argue about what the facts mean. Like, that's fine. There's a lot of biologists out there that are still arguing for a strict binary model because they think that the outliers of if 1% of the world is intersex, that's 80 million people. Right. And there's a lot of biologists out there that are just like, well, it's still percentage wise so small, or they use, the tree thinking rather than population thinking, or typological thinking rather than population thinking. And they're like, this is what this structure looks like. And even though, sex is a multivariate system with a lot of wiggle room and variation in there, and it doesn't have a single thing that's solely, determinant of the outcome, and it doesn't have a single factor that goes into sex that has only two options, not a single one of them do. Because the distribution is so bimodal, we're just going to name the lumps and go with the name. And if you're going on like an evolutionary level, sure. If you're going at like a really typological thinking, sure. But when you're dealing with actual human beings or any living organism, like in its population today, that it's simply not appropriate. And so like that's kind of the whole thing. It's just like there's science isn't as easy as just saying, here's the thing. There's a lot of discussion involved. And I think people need to be a little bit more understanding of that. Anyway, again, can't stress enough, I am very long-winded, especially on this issue. So, like, I hope I answered your question without, dumping too much on you.
Can I just ask one final question? It should be pretty quick, and then we can move on to another caller.
Yeah, totally.
If I were to describe a transgender person as someone whose gender does not align with their sex, is that technically not the best way to phrase it? And if so, what's a better way to phrase it?
I don't. So there's no like that is the definition of a transgender person, and so like that's fine. It's just their gender and their sex doesn't align. Their gender doesn't align with their sex. That's totally fine. It's just when you're doing these things, it's really important to remember like how you're saying these things and why. And so like the actual verbiage you're using is really fucking important, and I'm really happy you clarified. But you could very easily just put a slight little slant to your voice and make that, kind of accusatory and like trying to draw attention to something that has been used to diminish and dehumanize trans people. So you have to kind of just be caught. It's one of the, it's a shitty situation. And there's a million things like this where like, because of the history of marginalization and oppression of this community, you just have to be a little bit extra careful about what you're saying and why, and be willing to like correct it constantly and make sure that you're not causing more harm while trying to be well-intentioned and accurate in what you're saying, because that happens a lot with a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think one thing Forrest said early on is just really, really important to always have at the forefront when you're having this discussion is the fluidity of all of this, right? Like the fact that so much of this flows into so many other things and the distinctions aren't that clear. I love Christy Powell, a regular host on this show, was the host of Secular Sexuality. Maybe one day we'll get that going back up again. But he always said this, and I love this statement, which is embrace the ish and squish of life, because that's what so much of it is, man. So much of this is just squishy, not perfectly defined and laid out. But like when you jump full head first into all of that, what you come to find is a lot of really good shit. That's what I think, and that's what I've found. I mean, just imagine you're sitting around with a bunch of people and somebody says, gosh, I think we should be inclusive to people despite what their phenotype is. And then somebody jumps up and goes, no, actually, I want to discriminate against people on their genotype, actually. I think you're right. Long hair, short hair, blonde, brunette, doesn't matter. But like XY, we really need to discriminate. Just imagine that. Like, no, who you are, what you do in life. I'm not going to discriminate. But, it's just, again, going out of your way to find a reason to draw a boundary to push those people out. I don't think that you're ever going to find goodness at the end of that rainbow. But see, thank you so freaking much. I know there was so much information that Forrest has just uploaded into all of us. Here is the best freaking thing I can tell you, brother, which is that this was all recorded and you can go and rewatch it even in half speed to make sure you don't miss anything.
I don't encourage you to watch any more of my things ever, but I appreciate if you want to learn.
Thank you so much, Sethi. We really, really do appreciate it, man.
Maybe I should stop doing that.
Yeah. No, get out there, watch all of Forrest's stuff. Seriously, if anybody watching this hasn't seen your videos, man, I don't know what the hell they're doing. But seriously, Sethi, we really appreciate you, and I'm gonna let you go.